What if I told you that just 20% of what you do gets you 80% of the results?
Yeah.
That's the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
And we're going to unpack that today on the FBS Podcast Deep Dive.
It's
This is for mid-career professionals.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Kind of flies in the face of, just kind of steady effort gets you steady results.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah.
We're going to be referencing some discussions from the Forest Business School's linchpin program.
Right.
And so I think that's a great source for us to draw on.
And it's really targeted at mid-career people, too.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's they've been talking about this for a while.
So let's get right to it. What is the 80-20 principle?
Well, it's the idea that, 80% of your outcomes come from 20% of your effort or 20% of the causes.
Right, but it's not about
20% of the input.
Right. So it's not about striving for mediocrity.
No.
It's about recognizing that there are these little levers that we can push on that can get us disproportionate results.
Right. And the linchpin program talked about the story of a guy stranded in the Sahara Desert.
Oh, yeah.
And, his car breaks down and he's in the middle of nowhere. And he says, well, wait a minute. I don't need all of this car. I can just take the essential 20% of this car and make a motorcycle
and ride up
and get to safety.
That's pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
How does that apply to us in our everyday work lives?
Well, one of the things they talked about was in forestry.
Yeah.
20% of the trees in a hardwood stand are responsible for 80% of the value.
Wow.
One of the guys that owned a sawmill was saying that 20% of his clients generate 80% of his revenue.
Interesting.
And so it appears all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the numbers.
Okay.
It's about the thinking.
Right.
It's about sort of how you approach things.
So it's not just an analysis tool. It's more of a lens.
It's a way of looking at things.
Yeah.
Right. And it's saying, what's the vital few things that are driving the results here?
Okay.
And one of the guys was talking about should I become department head or not?
Oh, yeah.
It's a prestigious position.
Sure.
But he says, if I do that, it's going to take me away from the work I really like to do.
So he's thinking 80-20.
He's thinking 80-20.
And he's using it to make decisions.
Yes.
Yeah.
About what to do and what not to do.
And I think that's a really powerful thing for all of us to think about is, we get so caught up in what's urgent and what's right in front of us.
Right.
But maybe we're not thinking 80-20 about what's going to get us the biggest return.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's really hard to step back and look at the big picture and say, okay,
Yeah.
what are the things?
Yeah, what really matters here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's driving the outcomes I want?
So how do we actually start to apply this in our lives?
Well, one of the things that they talked about is this thing called 80-20 analysis.
Okay, so we're going to get into that, I guess, in the next segment.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
This is great stuff. I love this 80-20
It's
stuff.
powerful stuff.
All right, we'll be back in just a minute.
Yeah, it can be tough.
So what is this 80-20 analysis?
Well, it's kind of a data-driven approach, where you're
Sure.
really looking at the numbers
Okay.
and saying, okay, what are the activities, what are the, clients or products or whatever it is that are really contributing the most to the outcome I want.
I think about this in my own business.
Mm-hmm.
I do consulting.
Right.
And I realized one day that, 20% of my clients were giving me 80% of my headaches.
Okay.
And they were only producing about 10% of my revenue.
That's a classic example. Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, well, this is crazy.
Right.
Why am I putting up with this?
Yeah.
And so I started, really focusing on, okay, how do I attract the right kind of clients?
Right.
How do I systematize my services?
Yeah.
So that I'm not, killing myself.
Right.
For very little return.
Right. And the linchpin program talked about, sometimes just these little adjustments you can make.
Okay.
Like one of the foresters was talking about how, when they're cruising timber, they use this thing called a basal area factor.
Right.
And the standard one is 10.
Go.
But he said, if you use a 15 or a 20,
okay,
you get basically the same results.
So you're being more efficient.
You're way more efficient. You don't have to measure as many trees.
That's great.
And so it's just one of those things.
Can it make sense?
You just change it a little bit and
Yeah.
get a big...
Yeah. You're simplifying things.
Yeah.
I like it.
And they talked about, how complexity leads to these hidden costs.
Okay.
And it just bogs things down. And one of the guys who was an auditor was saying,
Okay.
So much of what I do is just unnecessary.
Just creating busy work.
Yeah. And it really hinders our productivity and it costs us money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something we can all relate to.
Yeah.
So, we're working smarter, not harder.
Exactly.
But it's not just about working all the time.
Right.
We've also got to recognize that not all time is created equal.
That's right. Right.
Right.
Yep.
And the linchpin folks talked about this too.
They did.
And, like one of the land managers was saying that even something as simple as checking the mail at a certain time every day can disrupt his flow.
It can throw you off. Yeah.
It can throw you right off.
Yeah.
It's like hitting a speed bump when you're cruising along.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they talked about this idea of scheduling your day from the back end out.
Yeah, that was from that podcast with Alex Hormozy.
Oh, yeah, right.
Where you start by scheduling your last commitment, and then you work your way backwards.
So you're making sure those important things.
So making sure the important things get done. And they talked about the power of... No. Remember that logger that we talked about earlier?
Yep.
Who said, I'm not going to become department head.
Yeah, because it's going to take him away from what he really enjoys.
And it's not just about opportunities, it's also about relationships.
Okay.
They were saying that a landowner with thousands of acres who's actively involved in forestry, you're going to treat that relationship differently than you would somebody who's got a little 40-acre woodlot.
Right.
Then they never even go out there.
Okay.
So, treat everybody fairly. Sure. But you got to allocate your time strategically.
Makes sense.
So this is where the Eisenhower matrix comes in. Remember we talked about that?
We did, yeah. The important and urgent.
Yeah, is it important? Is it urgent?
Right.
And how do you categorize your tasks? And remember that logger who invested in a heated trailer?
Oh, right. So you wouldn't have downtime.
Yeah. So he wouldn't have downtime in the winter.
Smart.
Yeah. So he was taking care of something.
That was important but not urgent.
Important but not urgent.
Right.
So that it wouldn't become important and urgent.
Yeah, like if his equipment broke down.
Exactly.
Middle winter.
And then he'd be...
Yeah, and then he'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
That's a great example.
Yeah, it's about thinking ahead.
Right, and they, talked about how even when you think about mowing hay, that's always kind of an urgent, important thing because of the weather.
Yeah.
But they said, if you apply that 80-20 thinking to it, you can figure out ways to...
So you're not always up against it.
Right. You're not always reacting. You're trying to be more proactive about how you set things up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that you don't, it's not always an emergency.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I like it.
And that kind of leads into this idea of continuous improvement.
Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about that next week. That's our next deep dive.
Which is all about constantly trying to refine your processes and get better and better.
So 80-20 and continuous improvement kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you're thinking 80-20, you're automatically looking for those high-impact areas.
Right, where you can make a little change, get a big result.
Right.
Yeah, I like it.
Because it's just kind of baked into the way you approach things.
So as we wrap up here on this deep dive on the 80-20 principle, what's the main thing you think our listeners should take away from this?
I think it's that you don't have to do it all.
Okay.
You can really focus on those vital few activities.
The 20% that gets you the 80%.
That's right.
And how do people actually go about figuring that out?
Well, you start by asking yourself, okay, what's the 20% that's going to get me 80% of the results I'm looking for?
Okay.
And then what can I stop doing?
What can I delegate?
What can I delegate?
Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah. So just start thinking that way.
And maybe that's what people can do this week is, really kind of sit down and analyze what they're spending their time on.
Yeah, what are those activities?
And which ones are really moving the needle.
Exactly.
Great stuff.
It's powerful stuff.
I love the 80-20 principle.
Yeah.
It's so simple, but it's so profound.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thanks for joining us for this deep dive on the 80-20 principle.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Remember, average is not okay.
That's right.
And we can do better by focusing on that vital few.
Absolutely.
We'll be back next week with a deep dive on continuous improvement theory.
I'm looking forward to it, Sienna.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.